There's something wrong with the tree line. You can feel it before you see it. A shape that doesn't belong to nature. A geometry too deliberate for woodland. Then the branch is thin. And it's there. Stone columns. A roofline cracked open to the sky. Windows the size of doorways, frameless now, looking out at nothing. The ivy has been working at the brickwork for decades, and it's winning. You walk inside, or what's left of inside, and the floor crunches under your feet. Fallen plaster, mostly. A ceiling that gave up sometime in the 80s. And there, above the ruin of a grand entrance hall, a chandelier still hanging. Cobwebbed. Perfectly still. As if it's waiting for something that isn't coming. Someone owned this. 20 years ago. And simply left. That's what this is about. Not the war, not the fire, not the flood. England built the most magnificent domestic architecture in the world, and then, over the course of about 60 years, quietly demolished most of it. What you're about to watch is not a list of pretty ruins. It's something closer to an autopsy. 10 houses, 10 dynasties, 10 moments when something built to last 1,000 years was simply let go. The further down this ranking you go, the harder it gets to watch. On a low hill in North Derbyshire, surrounded by colliery, spoil heaps, and farmland that doesn't know what to do with itself, there stands a shell. Just the outer walls, really. No roof, no floors, no interior at all. But the walls themselves, those are something. Baroque stonework of real quality, carved in 1724 for the Earl of Scarsdale, a man who wanted the world to know exactly how much money he had, and was not shy about it. At its peak, Sutton Scarsdale was one of the finest Baroque houses in the Midlands. The interiors were extraordinary. Plasterwork ceilings, panelled rooms, a staircase hall that visitors wrote about in their diaries for years afterwards. The Arkwright family owned it for a while, descendants of the cotton mill pioneer, which gives you some sense of the world it moved through. Industrial money meeting aristocratic ambition in the same building. Then, in 1919, the house was sold. The buyer was not a family. It was a group of speculators. Within a few years, they had stripped everything that could be stripped. The carved interiors were sold off room by room. Some panels ended up in American museums, Philadelphia specifically, where they still are. The staircase went, the fireplaces went, the lead from the roof went. What the speculators couldn't sell, they simply left open to the weather, and the weather did the rest. By the 1930s, it was a roofless skeleton. A local man named Sir Osbert Sitwell, a writer, was so horrified by what he saw that he actually bought it, not to restore it. He couldn't have afforded that, but just to stop anyone doing anything worse to it. He didn't want it. He just didn't want it to disappear entirely. It's in the care of English Heritage now. You can walk around it on summer weekends. The carved stonework on the exterior is still beautiful. Genuinely beautiful. And that's almost the worst part of it. You can see exactly what this was. You can see the quality in what remains, and it makes the absence of everything else feel more total, not less. Sutton Scarsdale wasn't destroyed by time. It was taken apart for parts, and somehow that's harder to forgive. Some houses die dramatically. Trentham Hall died of the smell. It sounds almost funny until you understand the scale of what was here. The Trentham estate belonged to the Dukes of Sutherland, one of the wealthiest families in Victorian England. Wealthier, by some measures, than the Crown itself. They had rebuilt the hall in the 1830s and 40s into something that contemporaries simply called one of the grandest country houses in England. Italian gardens stretching to a vast ornamental lake. A house of over 100 rooms. A private world of almost incomprehensible size and refinement. And then the potteries arrived. The industrial towns of North Staffordshire, Stoke, Burslem, Hanley, had been growing throughout the 19th century, and they had no sewage system worth speaking of. The Trent River runs through Trentham's grounds, and by the 1870s and 80s it was running black. The ornamental lake, fed by the same river, became, there's no delicate way to put this, a vast open sewer. The smell in summer was described by one visitor as unbearable at any distance. The family tried everything. Filters, diversions, chemical treatments. None of it worked. The Duke gave up. By 1905, the hall was largely abandoned. In 1912, the decision was made to demolish most of it. The main block, the great rooms, the interiors. Only the ballroom and the orangery and some outbuildings were left standing. The gardens survived, eventually reopened to the public. What's strange is that even the partial demolition took decades to complete properly. Bits of Trentham stood in various states of ruin well into the mid-20th century, neither preserved nor entirely gone. a kind of architectural purgatory. The gardens are there today. Beautiful, actually. They've been restored and opened as a visitor attraction. People walk through them on weekends without necessarily knowing what once stood at the end of that long promenade. A palace that was undone not by poverty or war, but by the Industrial Revolution making the countryside uninhabitable for the people who used to own it. There's something in that, something that sits uncomfortably. You won't find Beaudesert on any current map. Not as a building, anyway. The land is there. The parkland is there. But the house itself, a Tudor core expanded into a Regency mansion of real magnificence, was demolished in 1935. Gone. Completely. It belonged to the Marquesses of Anglesey, a family whose history reads like a compressed version of English aristocratic life at its most excessive. The first Marquess lost a leg at Waterloo and reportedly said, with a composure that became famous, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." To which Wellington replied, "By God, sir, so you have." The family accumulated wealth, land, and an appetite for theater of all kinds. One later, Marquess spent so much money on personal entertainments, theatrical productions, jewels, an almost deranged love of luxury, that he went bankrupt in 1905, forcing a sale that the family never fully recovered from. The photographs of Beaudesert's interior, taken before the demolition, show rooms of real beauty. Plasterwork, long galleries, a staircase that seemed to belong in something twice the size. The kind of rooms where you look at the photographs and simply don't understand how anyone could choose to destroy them. But choice is perhaps the wrong word. By 1935, there was no money to maintain it, no buyer willing to take it on, and demolition was the only option that made any financial sense. The lead, the timber, the stone, all sold. The contents dispersed at auction over several days, and then the walls came down. What remained was a stable block, some estate buildings, and a stretch of parkland that gradually went quiet. The site is accessible today, and people do walk there, but there's nothing to see, just trees and sky and the faint suggestion of formal ground that hasn't been formally kept for 80 years. Beaudesert is the kind of loss that doesn't make headlines. It's too complete. There's not even a ruin to mourn. This one is personal, not to us, to history. Halnaby Hall was where Lord Byron spent his honeymoon in January of 1815. He had married Annabella Milbank the day before, a marriage that almost everyone at the time thought was a terrible idea and that proved to be, even by the standards of Byron's life, spectacularly unhappy. They were at Halnaby for about 3 weeks. Byron wrote letters from there. Annabella wrote letters from there. The correspondence is still studied, still pored over for clues about what exactly happened in those rooms during those freezing January weeks. The hall itself was a handsome early 18th century house in the North Riding, not the grandest in Yorkshire but entirely respectable. The kind of house that accumulates quiet significance simply by being the backdrop to enough history. It passed through several families, fell into disuse in the 20th century, and was demolished in 1952. Not a brick remains. The farmland where it stood shows no trace. You can locate the general area from old maps and estate records, but standing there now you'd have no idea anything had ever been built on it. The field doesn't remember. Fields don't. And somehow, that's the detail that stays with you. That the physical space where one of the most dissected marriages in literary history began is now completely empty of everything except grass and the particular Yorkshire wind that doesn't stop. Byron was dead within 10 years of that honeymoon. The marriage collapsed within a year, and the house itself outlasted both of them by well over a century before it too gave way. Some losses are architectural, some are literary. Sometimes they're the same thing. There is a moment at Hardwicke that stops you. You're standing in the ruins of Hardwicke Old Hall, roofless, floors gone, windows empty, and 50 meters away, perfectly intact, its chimneys carrying the initials ES worked in stone, is Hardwicke New Hall. Built by the same woman, the same Elizabethan heiress, Bess of Hardwicke, one of the most formidable figures of the 16th century. She built the old hall, lived in it, decided it wasn't quite grand enough, and built the new hall next to it. Then she moved out and simply stopped using the old one. The old hall wasn't abandoned because it failed. It was abandoned because she succeeded. Bess built Hardwicke New Hall between 1590 and 1597, when she was in her 70s, which is remarkable in itself. High great chamber, a great hall, enormous south-facing windows that flood every room with light. It's still there, still intact, owned by the National Trust, largely as she left it. The new hall is extraordinary, but the ruin is what stays with you, because standing between those two buildings, one perfect, one a skeleton, you're seeing something that almost never happens. The same mind, the same ambition, the same moment in time, producing two buildings that ended up in completely opposite states. The new hall survived because it was the best one. The old hall became a ruin because something better replaced it. There's a lesson in that, though I'm not sure what it is exactly. Something about how even the very good things can be made redundant. Even something that was someone's entire world, replaced by a newer version of themselves. The ruins are managed by English Heritage. They're beautiful in an unsettled way. The two buildings look at each other across the grass, and neither one explains the other completely. There are ruins, and then there's Lothar, the castle. And it genuinely looks like a castle, towers and all, a great early 19th century fantasy of Gothic power, stands in its own grounds in the Eden Valley. And when you see it for the first time, it produces a very specific kind of confusion. Because it looks inhabited. The scale of it, the completeness of those outer walls, the way it sits in the landscape as if it expects someone to come back. And then you get closer and realize every window is empty and there is no roof, and the interior is a controlled tangle of stone and self-seated ash trees growing through what used to be floors. The Lothars were one of the great Cumbrian dynasties. The castle was built between 1806 and 1814 for William Lothar, later the first Earl of Lonsdale, at a cost that would have been staggering even then. The interiors were opulent, the grounds designed by landscape architects of real reputation. For over a century it was everything a great English house was supposed to be. The unraveling began after the First World War, as it did for so many of these houses. Death duties, reduced incomes, the impossibility of staffing a building that required dozens of servants to function properly. By the 1930s the family was struggling, the contents were auctioned in 1937, the roof was removed deliberately to avoid rates, and then decades of silence. The shell is extraordinary. Walking through it feels genuinely surreal, particularly in summer when the trees growing inside are in full leaf, green canopy visible above walls that were once ceilinged in plaster and gilt. It's been partially stabilized and is open to visitors now. The Lowther estate has done what it can, but there's something about the scale of Lowther's ruin that sets it apart. This was never a small house that quietly faded. This was a statement, a castle built to say something permanent about who the Lowthers were, and the permanence is there. The stone lasted. It's just that everything that made it a home is gone, and what's left is the shell of an argument nobody can finish. This one requires a slight explanation. Broadsworth Hall itself still stands, beautifully preserved, English heritage open to the public. It's not on this list, but Broadsworth sits in a part of the West Riding that was, a century ago, dense with country houses of comparable quality, and almost all of them are gone. Hickleton Hall, Hooton Pagnell, Campsmount, and Campsmount in particular, deserves a moment. Campsmount was a late 18th century house, not enormous but genuinely handsome, set in park grounds that the family had shaped over generations. It was requisitioned during the Second World War, as hundreds of houses were, by the military. And like many houses that came through the war damaged and modified and changed in ways that made their original purpose impossible to restore, it simply didn't survive the peace. By the early 1950s it was derelict. By the mid-1950s it was gone. The reason Campsmount matters, the reason this stretch of South Yorkshire matters, is that it illustrates something that's easy to miss when you look at individual houses. The loss wasn't random. There were areas of England where the country house landscape simply ceased to exist, not because of one catastrophic event, but because the economics had shifted so completely that no family could hold on. House after house, decade after decade, falling to demolition or fire or sheer abandonment, until the landscape forgot what it had been. You can walk through that part of Yorkshire now, and there's no visible evidence that it was once one of the more densely settled areas of the English gentry. The parkland has been absorbed. The drives are farm tracks. The kitchen gardens are either overgrown or converted. Gone, but not from any dramatic cause. Just gone because staying was no longer possible. This one is different. Most of the houses on this list were lost to economics, to neglect, to the quiet mathematics of inheritance debt. Wentworth Woodhouse was nearly lost to politics. Deliberate, personal, vindictive politics. And that makes what happened here feel less like tragedy and more like something else. Wentworth Woodhouse is the largest private house in England. Larger than Buckingham Palace, with an east facade that stretches for 600 feet, longer than any other country house in the country. It was built in the first half of the 18th century for the Marquesses of Rockingham, extended, refined, filled with one of the greatest private art collections in Europe. 2 prime ministers either lived here or were connected to it. The rooms are staggering. The pillared hall alone, with its columns and its painted ceiling, is the size of a substantial public building. After the Second World War, the house was passed to Lady Mabel Smith, a socialist politician who had been gifted it partly as a political arrangement, partly as a school. But in 1946, the newly elected Labour government's Minister of Fuel and Power, Emmanuel Shinwell, authorized open-cast coal mining operations directly adjacent to the house. The seam ran beneath its foundations. The machinery came to within a few meters of the walls. The south facade began to crack. Shinwell was asked repeatedly to halt or redirect the mining. He refused. In later life, he reportedly admitted that his decision had been influenced by his feelings about the aristocracy, that the sight of such private grandeur offended him, and that he had little interest in protecting it. Whether that's entirely fair to him is debatable. But the damage was real. The foundations were compromised. The house that had survived 250 years cracked under the weight of machinery that had been sent there, at least partly, as a political act. Wentworth Woodhouse survived. That's the unexpected turn. It survived Shinwell, survived decades of institutional ownership, survived a fire, survived everything, and in recent years has been taken on by the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust, which is slowly, expensively, painstakingly working to restore it. But the near miss is what matters here. The largest house in England was almost destroyed not by poverty, not by time, but by a government minister's personal contempt for what it represented. That's a different kind of danger. A reminder that these buildings don't just face economic forces, they face the full range of what humans are capable of, including deliberate destruction. Just across the border into Scotland, and I'm including it because to leave it out would be dishonest, stands the mausoleum, an enormous neoclassical dome, solid, intact, looking exactly as it looked when it was completed in 1858. There are railings around it, a locked gate. Inside, the sarcophagus of the 10th Duke of Hamilton, who commissioned the whole thing and was absolutely certain it would last forever. The mausoleum outlasted the palace. Hamilton Palace was the greatest private house ever built in Britain. That's not an exaggeration. The architectural historians are reasonably clear on this. Built and expanded across the 18th and early 19th centuries for the Dukes of Hamilton, it had a baroque north facade that contemporaries compared to Versailles. The staterooms were filled with objects of such quality that when the contents were sold at auction in 1882, the family needed the money. The sale lasted 17 days. 17 days. And the house was still standing. By the early 20th century, the ground beneath it had been undermined by coal mining. Different from Wentworth Woodhouse in that this wasn't political, just industrial, and the foundations were genuinely unstable. In 1921, the decision was made to demolish it. The demolition took 6 years. By 1927, the palace was gone. But the mausoleum remained. It's still there. You can see it from the road, this massive dome sitting in what is now a public park, surrounded by ordinary suburban Hamilton. Families walk past it. Children play nearby. And it stands there being exactly what it always was, a monument to a belief in permanence so absolute that it built a tomb before it built anything else, and the tomb is the only thing that survived. There's something almost too precise about that. 2 on the nose. The part built for death outlasted the part built for life. Make of that what you will. There is no single building for this entry. That's the point. Between 1945 and 1955, 10 years, the decade immediately following the Second World War, England demolished more than 400 country houses. Some sources put the number higher, 400 at minimum, in 10 years. That's 1 every 9 days. 1 a week, roughly, for a decade. Think about what that means. Not as a statistic. Think about it as a physical process. Somewhere in England, every 9 days, a house that had stood for 100 or 200 years. A house that contained within its walls the accumulated choices and obsessions and ambitions of multiple generations. A house with rooms where children had grown up and marriages had failed, and money had been made and lost, and portraits had been painted of people who are now entirely forgotten, was pulled down. The stone hauled away. The timber burned or sold. The foundations backfilled. the land returned to farming or simply left to grass over. Some of these houses were photographically documented before they went. Many weren't. We have records of names: Barlaston Hall, Nuthall Temple, Normanton Hall, Staunton Herald, Clumber Parks Hall. And for some of them we have photographs, architectural drawings, sale catalogues. But for many of them the record is almost nothing. A name in a demolition license, a line in a country house survey, the memory of someone who was there. The country life journalist James Lees Milne spent much of the 1940s traveling the country for the National Trust, visiting houses that were being offered for donation, writing reports on their condition and viability. His diaries from those years are extraordinary documents. He describes house after house. Some he managed to save, most he couldn't, with a mixture of genuine love for the buildings and a clear-eyed despair about what was coming. He knew. He watched it happening and could do almost nothing to stop it. What was causing it? Everything at once. The death duties introduced in 1894 and steadily increased until inheriting a large estate could mean paying up to 80% of its value in tax. The loss of agricultural rents that had underwritten country house life for centuries. The impossibility of finding domestic staff after 2 wars that had offered alternative employment. The requisitioning of houses during the war itself, after which many were returned in states of damage that made restoration prohibitively expensive. And, perhaps most fundamentally, the collapse of the social logic that had made these buildings necessary in the first place. The country house had existed as the center of a particular kind of life, political, social, agricultural, ceremonial, and that life was over. The building remained, but the world that needed it didn't. So the buildings went. 400 of them, in a single decade, and that's not counting the hundreds more demolished in the 20s and 30s, or the ones that went after 1955. The architectural historians who compiled the surveys, Marcus Binney, John Harris, the Save Britain's Heritage Campaign, estimated that across the 20th century as a whole, England lost somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 country houses, buildings that had taken generations to create, destroyed in the space of a single lifetime. There are fields across England right now, in Nottinghamshire, in Lincolnshire, in Yorkshire, in the Midlands, where, if you know what to look for, you can see the faint geometry of formal ground beneath the grass. The ghost of a drive. The slight depression where a basement once was. The line of an old wall visible only in the way the frost settles differently there in winter. The land holds the shape of what stood on it long after the building itself has gone. Most people walk past these places without seeing anything at all, which is perhaps the most complete form of loss, not the destruction itself, but the forgetting of what was destroyed. England built its aristocracy in stone. It built houses that were meant to say something permanent about who owned them, what they valued, what they believed the world owed them. And for a while, a long while, centuries, those buildings held. They stood through plagues and civil wars and revolutions that toppled every comparable system in Europe. They stood when everything around them changed. And then, in the space of a few decades, most of them didn't. Not because they were conquered. Not because the stone failed. Because the belief that had built them, the deep, unquestioned certainty that a family's claim on a piece of land was a permanent, inheritable, sacred thing, quietly stopped being true. And without that belief, the buildings had no reason to be maintained. Without that belief, they were just rooms. What you're left with, standing in any of these places, in the roofless shell of Sutton Scarsdale, at the base of Hamilton's orphaned mausoleum, in the Wentworth Woodhouse staterooms that somehow survived everything, is a particular kind of weight. Not nostalgia exactly, not admiration for the class that built them, something more disquieting than either of those things. The feeling may be that we build things to outlast ourselves, and they almost never do. That the certainty encoded in stone is still just certainty, and certainty runs out. The field is just a field now. The wind moves through it the same way wind moves through any field. Somewhere beneath the grass, if you knew where to look, you'd find the foundations, the outline of something that was once, for the people who lived inside it, the whole world.